Thank you very much. And again, just to say thank you very much to Professor Kemal for having invited me to speak at this Congress. And some of you would have heard me speak already yesterday and at 9 a.m. this morning. And this afternoon, I want to talk about delusions. And it's a little bit easier, because if you were here in the morning, I was talking about abnormalities of the self, which is a very complex subject and very difficult to get across. But I think delusions is a bit easier. That's not to say that it is, that's not to say simple. I just mean that it's easier to talk about. So I'm going to be saying a little bit about delusions in general. So I'll do all the things that everybody in this room already knows. I'll talk about the definitions of delusions, take you through some of the difficulties with the definition of delusions. And then I'm going to suggest to you that, that our way of thinking about delusions at present is probably wrong. And then I'll use 3 conditions to explain why I think our approach to delusions at present is wrong. So I'll talk about misidentification syndromes, delusional misidentification syndromes, and help you to understand the origins and the basis of it and the neuropsychology of it. And then I'll talk a little bit about pathological jealousy, delusional jealousy, with a view to help us to grasp why I think that kind of delusion is different from delusional misidentification syndromes. And then finally, I'll talk about Folie, Deux, which, as you know, is kind of currently, I think they're regarded as communicated insanity or communicated delusions. And so I'll say a little bit about that, and then I'll try and wrap things up. I hope that you will then find it interesting, and as ever, I'll be very, very pleased to respond to your comments and your questions and queries and so on, because your questions always help me to think a little bit more deeply about these matters. So I think that I've said a lot already in the last 2 days about the importance, the extraordinary importance of psychopathology, and how you couldn't be a psychiatrist without understanding psychopathology, and how you cannot treat psychopathology as if it's in the museum, that it's not just to do with definitions, and it's not to do with memorizing definitions or anything of that. So it's a living subject that you use it, that it's developing. You have to be reading about it all the time, because if you were to read Sims, the 4th edition, which I did in 2008, and you read the 7th edition, which came out in 2021, there's a lot of difference. So it's a developing, living subject. So please, don't just buy one textbook and think you've understood it. It's a developing, living subject. It's also important to say, as a precursor to anything else I say, that psychopathology is different from nosology. So psychopathology is the description of phenomenon, or phenomena, if you want to use the plural. And its purpose is to make beautiful descriptions. Secondly, to tell us the boundaries of the normal and the abnormal, and also to tell us the boundaries between the different kinds of phenomena that us psychiatrists see. So, and it has these presuppositions in it. And these presuppositions include a number of key fundamental principles. One is that we make these descriptions without much concern about causation. We just want to describe what the patients are experiencing. That's one. Secondly, we are totally, deeply interested in the subjective life of the patient. And our inquiries is done using this idea that Jasper's introduced, this idea of what you call the empathic interviewing or empathic understanding. And what it meant by that is that our inquiries, they are designed to recreate the experience of the patient in our own inner life. So all those questions that you're asking the patient, the purpose of them is to recreate the patient's inner life, their personal subjective experience in yourself. And you do it by empathic understanding. So you do it carefully and thoughtfully, and it is not warm or gentle, but it is a probing and deeply incisive method of trying to recreate the person's experience in ourselves. And then, you will know that Jaspers has a preoccupation with this word, understanding, because he wants to use the other word, which is ununderstandable. So this idea that us humans we have a natural understanding of another person. And this idea of understanding, it comes from the work of a German sociologist, a guy called Dilthey. And understanding in this context, what Dilthey was doing in the 19th century, his preoccupation in the 19th century was to try to see what the differences were between the human sciences, so psychology and sociology and history, for example, and the natural sciences, the mathematics and physics and engineering. And he was trying to understand what the differences between them were. And one of the things that Dilthey said was, and he uses a German word, Erklären, to capture physics and mathematics and engineering. That physics and engineering, that you have explanations. And we're using the word understanding technically, so that we have explanations. So when you push a car and it collides with another car, and that car moves, the explanation for why it transmits a force onto the stationary move to the object and the other object moves is an explanation. There's no psychological understanding. It's just an explanation. Whereas if you were to meet somebody whose mother has just died and the person is crying, you understand why it is they're crying. You can put yourself into their shoes. You can see that if somebody who they love dies, that it makes sense that they would cry. So that is the distinction which Dilthey was trying to make, which Jaspers then borrowed. And in English philosophy, they use two words for it. It's called reasons and causes. So in the physical sciences, you have causes. Whereas in the social human sciences, you have reasons. You can understand it. It is reasonable. You can see how somebody comes to cry. You can see why somebody might be angry if their property was stolen. It is just a normal human business of understanding how these matters arise from one another. So Jaspers borrowed this idea of understanding, and he brought it into our subject. And his purpose was to say that there are some phenomena which are not understandable, and that those phenomena which are not understandable, and he uses this wonderful word for it, that they are ununderstandable. That those phenomena tell us that you've got a process going on, that they are not humanly comprehensible. So if a person tells you that they have been replaced by robots, or if a person tells you that they're not the person moving their own arms, and you can see them moving their arms, that explanation that they've given, what they've just told you, is not understandable naturally to human beings. And therefore, that's one of the ways we know that a process is going on, that an illness is going on. So these are like fundamental principles of psychopathology. And these principles are fundamental and important. And we make a distinction between psychopathology and nosology. So nosology is just a description of disease. So it includes what the causation of diseases are. It includes what the likely life history, whether you get better from them, or whether they kill you, or whether they last for 6 months, or whether they last forever, whether they have an acute onset, or whether they have insidious onset. That's nosology. So the relationship between psychopathology and nosology is that you cannot have nosology without psychopathology, as you all know. So to say that somebody has a mood disorder, bipolar disorder, recurrent depression, you first of all have to understand what an abnormal mood is. You have to understand the nature of the pattern of it. You have to understand what are the other features associated with it. You have to understand what the nature of hopelessness is. You have to understand how hopelessness is related to time, because when you're hopeless, your attitude, your ability to look to the future is affected, so your way in which you see time is altered. So psychopathology, it helps you because it's the building block upon which nosology is built. All right? So that is the relationship between both of them. But nosology changes over time because we get more knowledge. But there's no reason to think that the human experiences that we deal with in psychiatry, the fundamental abnormal experiences, there's no reason to think that that's changing very much over time. So it's how we put them together and how we then ascribe a name to the disease that alters over time. So we know, all of us in this room, that the term schizophrenia is not likely to be existing in 50 years' time. And if it does exist, we know that it will splinter into several different conditions. But the experience that the patients are having when we do the assessments, that's not likely to change very much. So my re-emphasis is that psychopathology is fundamental and important. So that's my kind of prelude to talking about delusions. So the other thing I want to say at the outset is that psychopathology, psychiatry's work is fundamentally different from the work of physicians and surgeons. And let me try and explain what I mean by that. So the patients have a view about their inner life. So if let's say you're a hepatologist and you examine somebody's abdomen and you tell them that their liver is enlarged, and you tell them that because when you feel it, you can feel that it's rock hard and that it has the texture of the surface of it is a little bit funny and awkward, and you say they have cirrhosis of the liver, they're not going to complain or argue with you. You see, because first of all, they don't know what a liver is. They have no idea where their pancreas is. They don't know they have one. They don't have any idea where the spleen is. Therefore, they give to the doctor expertise. They think the doctor knows better. But in relation to psychopathology, to the subjective experience, in relation to your personal account of what it is that's going on inside yourself, all human beings regard themselves as expert about their inner life. And there's another aspect to this idea that they are experts in their inner life. There's also this idea that my description of my inner life, the technical term is that these experiences, they are immune from error. In other words, I cannot be wrong about it. So if I say I can hear a voice and you come along and say it's hallucination, I just say, go away, what do you mean by that? I can hear a voice and that voice is sounded exactly, and actually the aliens making me hear it. So psychiatry will never change in that respect. There's always contention because the patients themselves are experts in the inner life, whereas they are not experts about their physical bodies. They don't have any idea what peripheral nervous system is. They don't know what a CNS is. They have no idea where the lungs are and how they're structured. But they have a wonderful experience, personal experience of inner life. And they think their inner life is that they know what it is. And your explanations of it, or your descriptions of it, or your ascriptions of it is not as good as theirs, because and the causes of it, they think they know a lot about how human emotions are caused and how it flows and changes. That doesn't mean they're right. It's just a fundamental aspect of how humans are. So our subject will always be contentious because the patients regard themselves as expert in the territory. So that's just like a preamble. So what I want to now do is just talk about delusions. And everybody in this room knows what the definition of a delusion is. So a delusion is an abnormal belief or an erroneous belief which is held with conviction, which is resistant to argumentation or to criticism, if you want to think of it like that, and which is out of keeping with the social, cultural, and educational background of the person. So it's a beautiful definition, which everybody, all medical students know. So let's repeat it. It's a false belief or abnormal belief or erroneous belief which is held with conviction, which is recalcitrant to counter-argument, and which is not in keeping with the person's social, cultural, and educational background. So that's the definition which everybody in this room ought to know already. But there are different ways of thinking of it. So there's a Fish's textbook of psychiatry. I don't know whether you guys read it at all, but not the current one. So the current one, which is edited by my colleague Patricia Casey, that's not the one I'm referring to. So the previous one, so Frank Fish himself, who was a German Jew who was professor of psychiatry at the University of Liverpool, died in the 60s, many, many years ago. And he was the bridge between the German psychiatry the Anglo-Saxon English-speaking psychiatry, because he was a German Jew. He spoke fluent. Obviously, spoke fluent German. So he was the one who brought a lot of the German ideas of psychopathology into the English language. So he died, and then the book was taken over by Max Hamilton, who was professor of psychiatry at the University of Leeds, and Max Hamilton also spoke German. He spoke fluent German. So his account, his edition of Fish, Frank Fish's textbook, is worth reading if you can find it, and you can find it as a second-hand book, and it's a brilliant, absolutely brilliant book. And Max Hamilton's definition of delusion is slightly different from mine, from the one I've just told you. It's not totally different, but it's just slightly different. So that definition that Max Hamilton has, he turns it upside down. So he says that a delusion is most easily recognizable when it is out of keeping with the social, cultural, and educational background. All right? So I hope you can see the difference. So I say in my book that a delusion is a false belief which is out of keeping with social, cultural, and educational background. Max Hamilton turns it round and he says it is most easily recognizable when it is out of keeping. What he means by that is that you can have a delusion even when it is sitting on a cultural belief. All right? So that's what he's reminding you. So he's saying, don't think that because the person is a Catholic Christian, and Catholic Christians believe in possession, it doesn't mean that this person in front of you who believes in possession is that's not a delusion. He said it's only easy when the person doesn't come from a faith where they believe in possession. Do you see what I hope you can get the difference it's making. It's a beautiful difference, very subtle, but it's a wonderful difference, because it reminds you, please, please, please don't think that because the person believes in ghosts or because the person believes in spirits and their religion says spirits exist, it doesn't mean when they say they're possessed by a spirit that it's not a delusion. All right? That's what he's trying to tell you, that please think a little bit more about it. The fact that it's culturally sanctioned does not mean it's normal. So it's a beautiful definition. And then I want to say a little bit, because we talk about this definition so easily, and nobody stops to say, why is that the definition? So at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, there was a lot of discussion among psychiatrists about what the difference is between a normal belief and an abnormal belief. And the view was that a normal belief is flexible, that a normal belief is open to inquiry, and that what makes a delusion different from a normal belief is that it is held with conviction, and that it is resistant to counter-argument. Do you see what I mean? So the reason, we never say it in the books that what they're doing when Jaspers, writing in 1913, wrote his book, that what he's doing is he's saying that a normal belief is not fixed, not rigid, that it is pliable, that it is open to inquiry, that it can be changed. Whereas a normal belief, he says, is held with conviction. All right, so that's what he's trying to say. So please remember that that's what they're doing. And my task is not to confuse you guys, but I want to make an important point, which is that assumption which our colleagues made at the early part of the 20th century is not true. There are normal beliefs which are held with conviction, and they're not abnormal. They're normal beliefs. So if you were to tell me that I can walk through that wall, I'm going to hold the belief that humans cannot walk through a wall with extraordinary conviction. But I hope you're not going to be prescribing olanzapine, all right? Because I hope you too believe that we cannot walk through a wall, and that belief is held with conviction. And secondly, if you were to say to me that you could fly, that if you can jump from a 10-story building, you could fly. I don't believe you could fly. I think you just fall and die, and I don't think I can fly. So that's another belief which obviously we hold with conviction. Nobody can persuade us against it. So I'm just reminding you that even though we're using conviction And the recalcitrant to counter-argument as a way of determining whether something is a delusion or whether it's a normal belief. Actually, there are some beliefs that all normal people, I hope, hold firmly, because they just are the fixed beliefs that in this world that we live in, we know to be true. So that they're called they're called hinge, H-I-N-G. They're called hinge beliefs. So a hinge belief is a belief which I hope we share, which is a belief which allows us to have a conversation. So if I was to discover there was somebody in this room who thought we could walk through walls, I just walk past them. I don't want to have a discussion with them because I think there are some things we don't share in common. So these hinge beliefs allow us, as Wittgenstein says, allow us to open the door. It allows us to have a conversation. So there are beliefs that we hold which are full of conviction, but yet are normal beliefs. Secondly, you will know that it is so common, and I'm sure you're already thinking it. My trainees always I start the lecture and I get to this point and somebody puts their hand up to say, are there not beliefs which are false, but you still say that they're delusions? So the idea that is a delusion only a false belief? Are there not delusions which are actually a true belief, which are held with conviction? And as you know, the classic example, textbook example, my medical students' examples, which they want to use to undermine my definition, would usually be to do with, example would be to do with delusional jealousy, where it is a matter of fact that their spouse is actually having an affair, yet we will still say they've got pathological jealousy. How could it be possible that somebody, we know objectively that their partner is having an affair, yet we still think that the person in front of us has a delusion? All right? So I just use that to re-emphasize the point I'm making, which is that you can, in some situations, have matters which we know to be objectively true. Often, when we've got a situation like that where we know it's objectively true, it is the way in which the person, the reasons they use for saying that their partner is having an affair, that tells us it's wrong. So my classical, real example patient of mine, a man who had a delusional belief that his wife was having an affair and followed her everywhere. And he discovered, while she was at work, that she was taking the pill, and he couldn't believe that she was taking the pill because he had had a vasectomy. And when he asked her why she was taking the pill, she told him that she had never taken the pill before in her life, and she wanted to know what it felt like. And he believed her. He didn't use that as evidence that she was having an affair. At Christmas, his wife went out with her friends to a Christmas party, and he was so anxious that he went and followed her to the hotel. And in the evening, his wife came out with another man, and they walked into a cul-de-sac, and he followed them. He couldn't hold himself, and he got them in this cul-de-sac, and he asked her why she was there, what she was doing, and she said her contact lenses had fallen out, and this man had come to help her to find it. And he didn't use that as a reason for thinking she was having an affair. And when I asked him why did he think she was having an affair, he said that in the evenings, the dogs in the neighborhood have a special way of barking. And because of that bark, he knew that his wife was having an affair. And he said the way in which the light, the moonlight came into their sitting room through the curtains, the slant of them told him she was having an affair. He did not use any of the reasons which everybody in this room, I hope, would use to determine whether she was actually having an affair. He uses some abstruse examples of why he thought she was having an affair. So that is a real-life example of a person who has a belief, which is, in my view, I never asked his wife whether or not she was having, I didn't think that mattered at all. But in my view, there was objective evidence that she probably was having an affair. But he never used the evidence that we would have used objectively to make that case. All right? So we all agreed that we can have situations where there's objectively true event, but the way in which the person adduces evidence to judge it is why we then think they've got a kind of a delusional belief. So I hope I've done all the hard work there to remind us what the delusions are. Now, normally, when we're talking about delusions, then now I will start to talk to you about, my next step will be to talk to you about what the difference is between delusions and overvalued ideas, and what the difference is between primary delusions and secondary delusions. So that's what I would be doing, because that's just a systematic way of doing it. So we all know what a primary delusion is. So a primary delusion, there are at least 4 of them, and Jaspers will say that a delusional perception is one major example, which everybody in this room should have seen a case where you have a normal perception which has a delusional interpretation. So textbook example, you're driving down the road, the lights change from red to green, and you come to believe that you are going to be the next prime minister. You just know, because the lights tell you, the way they've changed tell you you're going to be. So that's a delusional perception. So the perception is normal. Everybody else will see that the lights have changed, but your understanding of why the lights have changed differs from that of normal people. So that's delusional perception. And you may not have realized yet or before that a delusional perception is built on exactly the same system, the same neurological system as language. All right? So as you know, the word we have for an object is just a random noise. You know, so my apologies because I don't speak Turkish and I wish I did. You know, so the word for a cat, there's nothing, as I say to the students, there's nothing cattish about the word cat. You know, it's just a noise. And the only reason why we all agreed the meaning of it and that we're not being detained by psychiatrists and treated is because we share that noise, we share that symbol. Everybody agrees that that noise means this animal. All right, so that problem that the patients have that we call delusional perception is a problem, the problem which is sitting on a normal infrastructure that we humans, we're very good at taking a symbol, in this case example, light, a change of light, which is just a symbol, which everybody else knows that it just means that the cars can move. But in this particular person, he misinterprets it as meaning that he's going to be prime minister. All right, so that's all that. So it is sitting on the normal infrastructure that all of us have, but it's obviously not working properly. And then you have the autochthonous delusion, which is a delusion which occurs suddenly, randomly, for no good reason, which is obviously false, and which the person fastens onto. All right, so that is a sudden, irreducible belief system. It's not coming from hearing voices, it's not because the mood is low or anything like that. The person just has that belief. Even that is sitting on a normal system. A lot of scientists and writers have inspiration. So an autochthonous or apophanic, apophonous delusion, they just arrive just like an inspiration. The difference between that and a scientist or a musician or a writer is that the scientist tests it and is able to jettison it if it doesn't make sense. But the actual system itself is the same, because that's just how new knowledge, new beliefs, new understandings, hypotheses and theories, that's how they arise. And then you have what you might call a delusional atmosphere or delusional mood, which also is regarded by Jaspers as a primary delusion. I have no idea. I just teach it because it's in the books. I have no idea why it's a primary delusion. Right? I just don't know, because it's not a belief, it's just a mood. But we all agree that that's true. And then we have delusional memory. And delusional memory is exactly the same as delusional perception. It's a normal memory which has delusional significance. All right, so that's the easiest way to remember a delusional memory, that it is a normal memory that has delusional significance. Now, I'm not going to, because my lecture today is not just to explicate the totality of the nature of delusions, but if somebody wanted to ask me when we get to questions about the difference between overvalued ideas and delusions, I'll be happy to answer it. And if you want to ask me what are the differences between secondary delusions and primary delusions, I'll be happy to answer it. And then you know that the next phase, if we were doing a lecture on it, would be then we start to look at the different kinds of delusions. So we start to talk about hypochondriacal delusions, persecutory delusions. So we're looking at all these different kinds of experiences that we've clustered together, and that would be normally how the lecture on delusions will go. And what I want to suggest today is that not all delusions are the same. And I mean by that even though they have a superficial family resemblance, so all of them are abnormal beliefs, they're held with conviction, and they're resistant to counter-arguments, so they've got that family kind of resemblance. But the hierarchical level of understanding delusions is exactly at the same level as understanding abnormal movements. And you will never, ever get a neurologist thinking that hemibalismus, or that rigidity, cogwheel rigidity, or intention tremor, or choreathytosis, that they were all the same things because they're all abnormal movements. Because the neurologist will be preoccupied with where in the nervous system the abnormality exists that makes those movements the way they are. Whereas in psychiatry, people talk about delusions as if they're all the same. So the next phase of my discussion with you is to start to try to suggest to you that we should be preoccupied with the origins of the delusions, because that will give us a good understanding of how they're formed. And that's what our interest should be, rather than just thinking of them at a very high level. So I'm going to take delusional misidentification syndromes and start off with them. And as you know, there are at least 5 of them, but I'm going to emphasize 3 of them, and then I'll just take one. So you know Capgras syndrome, you know Fregoli syndrome, I'm sure you would know syndrome of intermetamorphosis, and you probably know delusions of subjective doubles. And you may also know reduplicative paramnesia. So I'm just going to talk about Capgras, Fregoli, and intermetamorphosis. All right? And you can look at the others, because you can Google them, and it will all be there for you to read. So Capgras, as you know, is the patient's belief, is a delusional belief, that their father has been replaced by an impostor or by a robot. All right? So they accept, they don't dispute the idea that their father, that this man who is saying he's their father, that he looks exactly like their father. So there's no misrecognition. They are accepting that this man looks like him. But for whatever reason, they think he's an impostor. So that's Capgras. Fregoli syndrome is the reverse. So in Fregoli syndrome, the patient looks at somebody who does not look like their father or their mother or their sibling or their spouse at all, and believes that this person, who doesn't look like their relative, is actually their relative, and believes that they are wearing a mask of some sort. All right? And just to make that point for you to really grasp it properly, so a real example from a patient of mine. She's on the train from Birmingham down to London. She in her day-to-day life, her boyfriend is a white Irishman. And she's sitting next to an African Caribbean who's as dark as I am, sitting next to her, and she comes to believe that this black man is her white Irish boyfriend. All right? So that gives you an idea of what a Fregoli is. A Fregoli is saying that this person who does not look at all like my spouse, doesn't look like my father at all, actually is my father. All right, so that's Fregoli, which is astonishing. I'm sure that you find it as astonishing as I do. In fact, there are reports, if you were to go and look at them, where somebody identifies a dog or a cat as their relative. So it doesn't even have to be human for them to identify it as their relative. All right, so that's Fregoli. And intermetamorphosis is a little bit more complicated. In the sense that the patient is identifying somebody who doesn't look like their relative at all as their relative, as their son, but they're basing the recognition on a characteristic, either their nose or the shape of their face or something about how they walk or something like that. So it's based on some similarity, but everything else will be different. So that's the three delusional misidentification I want to talk about. So why is the subject? Why has delusional misidentification? Why has it become so important in psychiatry? Why do people continue to write about it? It can't just be because it's very astonishing sometimes, and obviously it's associated with violence. So psychiatrists always want to make sure they recognize the conditions which are associated with violence, because sometimes the patients think this man who is pretending to be my father is actually a robot, and there's a case description of him cutting the person's head off because he was expecting to find wires in there because he thought it was a robot, and then was to surprise it was a man and there's blood coming out and so on. So it is associated with violence. So if you have cases in your clinics, you've got to be very careful because it can be associated with violence. But that's not why it's interesting to us. It's interesting to us because it is very, very similar to prosopagnosia. So if I remind you what prosopagnosia is, and if you've read your Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, that's Oliver Sacks' example of prosopagnosia. So prosopagnosia is the impairment of face recognition. So the person cannot recognize their relatives, their parents, their siblings, their spouses, just by looking at their faces. So this idea, and we know the neurology of prosopagnosia. So we know prosopagnosia is caused by usually bilateral anoxia of the occipital cortex, of the lingual gyrus, essentially. So we know exactly. So when people started to write in the 80s and 90s about delusional misidentification syndrome, the idea was that for the first time we will have a psychiatric condition where we could point to a bit of the brain which is malfunctioning. So that's why the interest was, because the idea was we've got a person who looks at their father and cannot recognize them properly. And we know a neurological condition which is prosopagnosia. Therefore, please, let's study this. And I need to then tell you some things you are not likely to know it, and if you know it, that's wonderful. You're not likely to know that in prosopagnosia, even though the person cannot recognize their relatives, sometimes they can recognize their gait. So a lot of them use the trick of recognizing the gait. So it's a problem of faces, not a problem of gait. So if they see the person walking, they can tell. Some of them, of course, are waiting to hear them speak because they can recognize their voices. But most intriguing, wonderfully intriguing, is the idea that if you put them on a galvanic skin response, technically, ordinary language, a lie detector test, so you wire them onto a galvanic skin response, and you show them 50 pictures, and you include in those 50 pictures some pictures of their spouse or their relatives. When the picture of their relatives come, there's a flicker on the galvanic skin response. So the guy who did the work, Brewer, came to the conclusion, an American psychologist, came to the conclusion that there must be at least two visual recognition pathways. That there's one recognition pathway, which is iconic recognition. You look at a face and you recognize that you know who that person is. And the second is, even when you don't recognize their face, you are still getting, if you want to think of it like that, like an autonomic response, which is confirming that you know who this person is. So in order to have an overt recognition, you have to have both of them matched. So you've got to have iconic recognition, so you look at the face, and you have to have the autonomic recognition, and they have to be matched, and then you know that you're in the presence of your wife, or you're in the presence of your sister, or something of that sort. So that's Brewer's work with prosopagnosia. Neurology is always more boring than psychiatry, because of course, as you know, in neurology, the conditions are unchanging. They don't fluctuate, you can't treat them, they don't go away or anything like that. Whereas in psychiatry, the conditions. If it was prosopagnosia, everybody, you wouldn't be able to recognize all your relatives. Whereas in delusional misidentification syndromes with Capgras, there's usually 1 or 2 or 3 people that you misidentify. You know, so psychiatry is always more interesting. And secondly, it waxes and wanes. And thirdly, if it occurs in the context of schizophrenia or bipolar psychosis, then you treat it with olanzapine and it goes away. So it's not like neurology. As I say, to me, psychiatry is infinitely more interesting because you can solve the problems of neurology more easily. So our colleagues, Andrew Young and others working at the time, they're retired now, they're older than I am, and at the time they were working in Bangor in Wales, and they showed absolutely elegantly that in Capgras, in delusional misidentification syndromes, that these patients, that they had an absence of the autonomic response to the faces of their relatives that they were misidentifying. So there was no impairment of iconic recognition. So they knew they looked exactly like their father. They knew they looked exactly like their mother. But the matching autonomic response, which would have confirmed that these were their relatives, was absent. So that's the beauty, the absolutely wonderful beauty of this sort of neurophysiological work, which shows you something which is going on in psychiatry. And I need to tell you a little bit more, and that these abnormalities, these neurophysiological abnormalities, in some of these cases, persisted outside of their declaring that these were not their relatives. So when you treat them with antipsychotics, they were no longer saying that their father had been replaced by a robot, but when you tested them, they still had impairment of autonomic arousal in relation to these subjects. So I want to use that to say that we don't have a full understanding of why it is that these people have these beliefs, so because they don't have it to every face. Secondly, even when you've treated them, the autonomic impairment may remain, but they're no longer expressing the delusional belief. So it's not an issue which is answered. And so the first thing to say at the end of that little section is to say that my view is that there's some delusional beliefs which arise out of minor impairments in cognitive function. In this particular case, they've got minor impairments of face recognition systems. And if you wanted to ask me a little bit more about face recognition systems, I'd be very delighted to talk about. So let's move on to the next. So we want to now talk about delusional jealousy, and talk about delusional jealousy and separate that kind of delusion from one that is caused by impairments in cognitive function. And I don't mean gross impairments in cognitive function. So I'm not talking about Alzheimer's or anything like that. I'm talking about impairments which are not demonstrable on day-to-day life. So that these patients, when they're carrying these abnormalities, but these abnormalities are not demonstrable. They're not missing their way in the road. They have no difficulty in working. My own patient, I'm happy to talk about later on, was working successfully, yet they've got these minor impairments of cognitive function. So jealousy is a wonderful area to talk about, because what it does is it helps us to see how evolutionary biology impinges on our subject. And now, of course, evolutionary biology impinges on our subject in very many phenomena. It impinges on our subject in anxiety states. It impinges on our subject eloquently, wonderfully in obsessive compulsive disorders. And as you will know, it impinges on our subject in anorexia nervosa. And that's just to talk of 3. You know, so you should all be reading the books that are coming out in evolutionary psychiatry, sometimes called, or evolutionary biology, or evolutionary psychology, because they're fundamentally interesting and important for our subject to understand your patients, you know. So I'm just going to use jealousy as a way of helping us to start to see how that might work. So we're in the area of mating behavior. All right, so if you were to look the books up and you wanted to see how how this relates to jealousy. We're talking about mating behavior, and we don't need to talk about humans first. So just concentrate on the animal world. And we know a lot about how animals mate and the extent that the males go to protect their sexual exclusivity, to ensure that the progeny are really their progeny, because if they're going to expend a lot of energy looking after the progeny, they want to be assured that it is their progeny. So, and we're not talking humans. So, if you think, just think of spiders, not humans, just spiders. Male spiders are so determined to ensure that the progeny of the female is theirs, to the degree that they would fracture their penis to seal the vagina to ensure that another male spider cannot come there. I mean, that is how desperate these male spiders are. And we're not talking humans. And think of rats. So the rats have produced pheromones. The male rats produce pheromones. And these pheromones ensure that if the female is already pregnant, that she aborts every single fetus that she has before this male mates with her. All right, so, and all of that is to ensure that progeny is his if he's going to work for it. And you all know about the lions, which is the classical textbook example in this area of work, that the lions, when the first thing the male lion does when he joins the pride of lions is that it either kills all the cubs or it drives them away. All right, so these behaviors, they are patterned behaviors which replicate some of the behaviors of humans. And so we, as I say, we know a lot about it. And we know a lot about the underpinning reasons for these ways of behaving. So the technical term for it is that there's an asymmetry of energetics between men and women. And you should know this already because it's commonsensical. It's just that they have technical names to them. So the asymmetry of energetics, very simple. The female spends a lot of energy building a big, unwieldy egg. The males produce flimsy material. It doesn't require much energy at all. So the females have to be absolutely sure that the person who's going to have access to those eggs has to be a reliable individual. It's just common sense. And the males, because it takes very little energy to make it, but if they're going to work to support a person, they want to be assured that the person they're supporting. So you can see straight away how these behaviors come. And so that's how jealousy comes about. So I tell you about that because I want you to start to see that there's an evolutionary biology mechanism that's working in normal jealousy. And we understand normal jealousy. So with everything to do with psychology, our colleagues in psychology will say that you've got to have a cognition, you have to have an associated emotion, and you've got to have a behavior that is recognizable. And that those three things together show you the pattern of behavior that we recognize and call jealousy. So the cognition is not just positive cognitions, there are negative cognitions involved. So some of it is, my partner is likely to be having an affair. If my partner is having an affair and other people find out, then I will be the laughingstock of the community. And how terrible it will be if it's not a sexually exclusive relationship and so on. So those are the cognitions. And the mood, the emotions associated with it will be anxiety because I might be seen to be a fool by other people, or how terrible it will be if he leaves me for that person. So you've got the anxiety of rejection and that sort of stuff. And you've got sadness that I've put a lot of effort into this, and if I've got this, put a lot of effort into it, and I lose it, then that's not very good. So you've got low self-esteem and so on. So we understand that. And the behaviors, exactly as the psychiatrists know them to be, that you do a lot of watching the person, a lot of following them, a lot of cross-questioning them, and so on. So those behaviors are exactly as they are in psychiatry, and these are normal. So the question for me, from you guys, is how do we distinguish between pathological jealousy and normal jealousy? So simple, there's nothing clever going on. Pathological jealousy is where there's no good reason for it. Do you know what I mean? There's no good reason for it. There's no reason to be anxious about it at all. So normal jealousy I'm not suggesting that it means that the partner is actually having an affair, but what I mean is there might be cues. So the classic would be that people go to a party and their partner has a dance with somebody else. So it's not meaning that, I don't mean by that the fact that their partner is having a dance with somebody else means that they're having an affair. But you can see the triggers in the normal. Whereas in the abnormal ones, there are no triggers to be seen. No triggers exist. So it is not comprehensible because it is not arising out of an understandable set of circumstances or cues. And there's an exaggerated response. So the belief is not amenable to reason. Even if you pointed out that the person hasn't left the house for the last month, and we all know they haven't left the house for they still continue to believe that they haven't. Do you see what I mean? So it fulfills all the criteria that we will normally set out for saying something is abnormal. So that's a pathological jealousy. But we are preoccupied with it in psychiatry because, like with delusional misidentification, it is associated with violence. Normal jealousy is associated with violence. There's a lot of work to show that normal jealousy accounts for physical abuse of women. It accounts for a lot of domestic abuse. It accounts for people turning up in casualty, haven't been beaten up. And it accounts for a lot of people who are in prison, males who are in prison. So it is heavily associated with violence. And that takes me then to talk a little bit about familicide, because familicide is a wonderful demonstration of all the stuff that I've been talking to you about with the animals, with ethology. So the males who kill their wives and their children, practically all of them have arisen out of jealousy. And we're not talking about normal jealousy. We're not talking about any reason to do it. We're talking about pathological jealousy. But you need to know that in most of these situations where these men kill their families, the children are usually stepchildren. All right, so again, it takes you straight back to talking about these lions that I was telling you about earlier on. So all I want to do is draw your attention to the idea that you've got delusional misidentification. We can see the neurobiology of it. We can see the cognitive impairments in it. We can see how that drives the person to have these beliefs. And what I've just shown you is that we have jealousy, delusional jealousy. We can understand it. We don't know exactly where it works in the brain, but we can understand the biology of it. We can see that it is sitting on a normal brain system, and where, sadly, in these cases, it is impaired or it's affected in some way in these patients. And the last one I want to talk about, and then we draw things to a close, is to talk about Folie Deux. So Folie Deux is of interest to us precisely because it is a belief system which is transmitted from one person to another. Yet the person to whom it is transmitted holds it with conviction. All right, so we have a situation where one person has, as in the case of a patient of mine, believed that he was the rightful heir to the throne of England. So that was his fixed belief. He had a grandiose belief that he was the rightful heir, and he wrote to the Queen Elizabeth, when she was alive, to say she should vacate the throne, that he was the rightful heir to the throne. But his mother believed it too. You know, so it wasn't just him. His mother, he induced his mother to believe it too. So that's Folie Deux. And of course, you know, it can be Folie à quatre, it can be Folie à trois, it can be Folie à famille. So it's not just two people. Sometimes it's a very large. And of course, you also know it can be Folie à a large society of, you know, we know that there are several cases where the one person, persuades, thousands of people to kill themselves on a given day because God is waiting for them and so on. So it can include large numbers. It doesn't have to be just two people. So the reason we're discussing it is that we've got a real example of where an abnormal belief, which fulfills all the criteria for delusions, is transmitted to another person who then holds this as a belief. And don't believe the books too much, because the books say if you are to separate them, the belief goes away in one. All right? When you read the literature properly, actually, the beliefs only disappear in about a third of them. There's a lot of complicated discussions about why that might be the case, because people want to say that the real case is genetically related to the secondary case, and therefore maybe the secondary case themselves have an incipient psychosis. So people want to say things like that. But what I'm concerned about today is to say that you have an abnormal belief induced in another person who, when they're separated, continues to have a fixed belief. That's all I'm interested in communicating to you. So the delusion is transmitted. Now, and then I want to make the point that the transmission of beliefs is happening every day. That's what I'm doing there now. I'm transmitting beliefs. It's a normal human thing to transmit beliefs. The guys in church, I'm transmitting beliefs. The politicians are transmitting beliefs. The guys in the mosque, they're transmitting beliefs. So transmitting beliefs is a common human phenomenon. It's not rare. We're doing it all the time. And even to make it more complicated, social psychology tells us that these guys, they know exactly how to transmit the belief about which soap you should buy and which are the best dresses, which car is better than another car, because they're all beliefs. And we know the foundational systems for transmitting beliefs. We know the person who transmits it has to be an authority figure. They've got to be physically attractive. What they're transmitting has to be consigned in some way, constructed in such a way that it is easy for the person listening to accept it. And you can see all these phenomena if you look at the adverts for toothpaste. The person is in a white coat, usually an attractive woman, and she tells you how wonderful, Sensodyne is, and she has a beautiful set of teeth, and she gives you by example that Sensodyne is wonderful. And you go out next time, you ditch Pepsodent and you buy Sensodyne, So the point I'm making is transmission of beliefs is going on all the time. And in Folie, Deux, they say that it's got to be one person with a stronger personality against a person with a weaker personality. They've got to be very close together, and the belief must be conducive to both of them. And they're able to transmit it. And the reason why I'm talking about it is to show you that's another kind of belief or delusion. So the first one we talked about, transmitted, the person gets it because they've got cognitive impairment of a particular kind. The second one I talked about is sitting on a normal evolutionary biology of mating behavior. That system is completely different from the first. And the third one we talked about is using the same systems that we use to persuade others. So it's persuasive communication, if you want to go and look it up in the books. So we understand a lot about persuasive communication. And that is using persuasive communication to transmit an abnormal belief. And the other person who they've transmitted it to can continue to hold that belief even when they're separated. And there's no reason to think that these three somehow, because we use the word delusion, that they're the same things. So to summarize, what I hope I've done is I've taken a simple system, a delusion, and I've opened it up for you, and I hope you've learned something from it, and it's been a great pleasure to me to talk to you. So thank you very much.